So the topic is payments, and the reason this is one of the most important areas of doing business. Obviously, when everybody's going global, they have products that they need to get in country, but they also need to get paid. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep dive, what I like to call sort of a master series look at global payments today. Payments is often misunderstood. There's a lot of great domestic providers out there, gateways, banks, other channels that help support domestic payments, but often those same ecosystems and people and experts that understand the domestic market don't have expertise or understanding of how global payments work. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. So what we'd like to do today, we brought in an expert, Matthew Cannon from Go Interpay, to talk with us about the challenges and opportunities around global payments. He's going to level set sort of the most important areas of global payments so that companies on the line and listening in can understand, you know, some things that you can do to optimize this very important sort of critical aspect of doing global business. Today we are going to be focusing on the companies and sort of the infrastructure and design needed for direct-to-consumer business, and we can always follow up. If you have additional questions, there are some differences in B2B payments that we can send you additional information around, so please do not hesitate to contact us to get that information, as we can send it over for those that are interested. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matthew Cannon. Matt.
Hey, Carl, thank you very much for that introduction. So as we start really taking a look at this, I'd like to just kind of set the big picture of kind of a shift what we've seen in the market, where it truly is now, if you're selling online, you are global from day one. Looking at some of the global phenomena that's currently happening now is that basically 82% of all buyers who buy online have purchased something online from a retailer that's not in their domestic market. 46% of online shoppers don't even care where that retailer is based. It really just depends, is the product that they want, does that retailer have the product that they want? Is it easy to buy? Is basically, and is it at the price that they're looking for? They don't really care if they're based in Germany or if they're based in the U.S. It's really just, can you provide that seamless experience for the product I want at the price I want? So as you have that, so basically what happens now is someone comes onto your website, they just expect that you're going to be able to service them. And as long as you are able to make a seamless experience, they will buy from you. So it really comes down to, on the payment side, payments, you want it to be as smooth as possible and have as least friction as possible. So when you're looking at what does that global shopper really want, here are a couple of the key features that they want that I'll kind of go into detail as the presentation goes on. But they really are, first and foremost, they want to pay in their local currency. But even more so than paying in their local currency, they don't want to pay a premium for that. There's been a lot of history in the past where retailers would, you know, their products would be in U.S. dollars, and then they would price it in, say, euros, but they would do a big markup. They would pick some outlandish price because they figure they can get a higher value for in the specific market. And now with this day and age, with people being able to go around with VPNs and stuff, that usually will deter sales. So of course they want to pay in the local currency, but they really want it to be a favorable exchange rate and not really marked up. And of course they also want a frictionless experience, and this really goes into looking at, like a lot of times with fraud. Just because you're shipping it cross-border, you don't necessarily want to have a lot of additional fraud rules or steps or processes because you see it as higher risk. That a lot of time is going to really deter yourself. So it's having the proper checkout experience, but the proper rule set fraud, make sure you cover yourself, but it's still a seamless experience. And of course, they want a secure checkout. As you go to different markets, especially within Europe or like Australia, They're very concerned with privacy. They're very concerned with data. So having a secure checkout where they know that the information is going to be securely handled is very important. And of course, they're going to want to pay in the preferred payment method. As I'll touch base a little bit further in the presentation, that there are a lot of people don't necessarily have credit cards globally. So you really need to be able to accept the payment in the way that they can pay. So looking at the first part, here's actually a study that PayPal recently did, where it really shows like what does that global cross-border shopper really prefer. And some of the key ones here is that it's very obvious that 72% of the customers want to pay in their local currency. And 45% don't feel comfortable paying in a different currency. And a lot of times, when you look at a way to look at currency, I look at it very similar to language. Just like, you know, if I'm a German speaker and I don't really speak English, when I go to the website, it's very important to have it be in German language. It's really going to help me understand what this is selling. Well, the same goes for currency. When it's in a different currency, you don't necessarily understand it. Like right now, as a U.S. person, if I see something for 144 Australian dollars online, I don't really know what that translates to U.S. dollars. So when you look at friction, a lot of times as you look at one of the other key stats here, is that consumers, 61% of consumers will actually check the currency conversion rates before they actually purchase. So what happens is a lot of times if you don't price it in that local currency, you're just creating additional friction, where I'm going to have to go off-site somewhere and understand, okay, I'll go into some currency calculator and put in what that amount is in the whatever the currency is for that retailer selling it, to find out what it is in my local currency. And it's a cardinal rule that you never want the shopper to ever leave your website. You want them to continue on that path to purchase. So it's incredibly important to make it that easy for them to always present and process in that customer's local currency.
Matt, if I can interrupt.
Yep.
If I can interrupt just for 1 minute, I apologize. I just want to remind people that we are taking questions throughout the presentation via the chat box. So if you have a question, please feel free to enter it there, and we'll try to get it to Matt while he's giving his presentation, and we'll also open up the lines via audio Q&A at the end of the session. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, no problem. And you see with this slide, what this actually slide is showing is that even if you don't price in your customer's local currencies, they're still paying in their local currency. For example, like if I'm a Canadian customer, my bank accounts, my PayPal accounts, everything is based in Canadian dollars. So ultimately what happens is even if you're still pricing in US dollars, the banking partner, whoever's processing that transaction, is actually converting it for you. But what often happens is they're converting that at a really high premium. So what this actually slide shows is just another retailer who's priced in US dollars, and we're checking out through a Canadian customer's checking out. So as you can see, when they go to PayPal, the value is $227 is what the product value is. And as PayPal is then converting that into their customer's base currency, which is in this case is Canadian dollars. So they're converting that on the spot to Canadian dollars. But if you actually take a look at like using Etsy.com, or you can use Yahoo Finance, or there's many providers that actually show you what the real exchange rate is. If you check the exchange rate at the same time, you can see that PayPal is adding an additional 3.5% to the product price. Now, I know you're probably thinking like, gee, I already pay enough to PayPal to process the dang transaction, and then they're marking it up another 3.5%. So that 3.5% that your customer is paying for a higher price for your product is going into PayPal's wallet or the credit card issuing company's wallet instead of yours. So not only can you really help streamline the process, oftentimes you can put better control on your pricing and increase your margins by not giving that 3.5% away to the payment providers.
And so I do want to, highlight that, because I think, in the past, if we're talking 5 or 6 years ago, the consumers might be okay with this. But as, the market matures and the consumers get more sophisticated, as Matt mentioned, it's really a huge barrier to ask these consumers, especially in certain countries, to take that lift and to take the risk, if you will, of what they might be charged on their credit cards. So I think Canada is a great example, because a lot of Canadians are very sophisticated and only really want to buy from merchants that are pricing in Canadian dollars. So I do want to take a moment here and really stop and say that this has definitely shifted over the last 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing about it is one of the things I mentioned is people want to pay in their local currency, but they want to pay at a favorable rate. So what happens is, a lot of times when they go to this checkout and they see what the price they're actually going to pay in Canadian dollars, you'll have a higher abandonment rate. They're going to leave. So just imagine what happens to your sales today if you were just to increase your product, everything in U.S. dollars, 3.5%. Is that going to hurt sales or help sales? Oftentimes, it's going to hurt it. So this is another thing of understanding that this is currently happening now. If you're selling to anyone outside of the U.S. and not pricing in the local currency.
And I would add to this, the conversation, obviously today's topic is around payments, but whether you're a B2B business or selling direct to consumer on your website, payments, especially when you're talking about global payments, really has to do with money management. And so, the first topic that Matt is going after here is certainly the all-important, currency and how it works, which really is, you have to sort of lump and think of these things as, money management and payments.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing to really looking at this is once you kind of say, okay, you've done the first step and you're now kind of setting the pricing in the local currencies. The second is to say, as you're running through the checkout, is actually how are you processing that credit card transaction. Typically, you have basically two choices here. You can still utilize, say, like your U.S. acquirer, or say if you're looking to really sell into Europe or Canada or Australia or Brazil, wherever it is in the world, you can look at, well, do I want to process that cross-border through like a U.S. bank, or do I want to process that locally through, like, say, using Germany as an example again, process that through a European bank. And so one question I always look at in asking a lot of the retailers that I speak with is, so they usually will have a domestic U.S. website that they're selling to U.S. customers. And I ask them, would it ever make sense to just process all of these transactions, these U.S. domestic transactions, through a UK-based bank? And generally the response is, well, no, I don't think that sounds like a good idea. It inherently sounds like a bad idea. Why would you process these transactions through these U.S. cards through a non-U.S. bank? It just seems like it's going to add additional cost. They're not going to know the market as well. The approval rates won't be as high. And I usually tell them, you know what, you're 100% right. It's absolute best practice to process your U.S. customers through a U.S. bank. But then I say, well, but why do you think it's okay then to process it, a UK customer, through a U.S. bank? Because you're going to run into the same issues. Anytime you do a cross-border, you're going to have additional friction points that can always cause trouble. So when you look at really comparing cross-border payment processing, a lot of times what happens is you're going to have, if you're processing it cross-border, you're going to have lower credit card approval rates. And one of the main reasons for that is just the issuing banks will see these transactions as higher risk. A good example is say if I just was in a Starbucks and I just used my credit card and I buy my coffee, and then I have my coffee and I have my laptop with me, I open it up and I start shopping. And sure enough, I see this incredible pair of pants from a UK retailer. And I go in and I process that transaction. what happens is my issuing bank's going to say, hey, you were just at Starbucks right now, and I see this is from like a transaction based from a UK merchant. You know, it looks like the transaction's okay, but it looks a little fishy. So I rate it higher in fraud, so I'm just going to then cancel that transaction. And this happens a lot too, as if you ever have gone like traveling and you didn't tell your bank you were leaving the country. A lot of times when you go to that new country and you go to the restaurant or you go anywhere and first use your credit card, it can oftentimes be declined. This is because like your issuing bank has certain fraud rules set up to flag these transactions. And so the same thing happens online. And of course, as you're really looking into this, another big thing that happens with cross-border processing is usually your processing fees will actually go up. And this is just a great comparison is just like on the shipping logistics side, is if you're shipping the product domestically, it's usually going to be a lot cheaper than if you're shipping it cross-border. So the same thing kind of happens with payments. If you're processing it cross-border, it's going to be much more expensive than if you're actually processing it locally.
I think these points are you know, I just want to stop and really make sure that everybody understands the second point here, because it is, I think, the most misunderstood area of global payments. Oftentimes companies think, oh, okay, I'm charging my consumer in a certain currency, therefore I'm processing locally, which couldn't be further than the truth. At the Grin, we've surveyed our membership, and somewhere between 10 and 40% decline rates on cross-border transactions. So it's a big deal, and it's a very important concept to understand, to grasp, because imagine, you know, in Matt's example, if he was at Starbucks, but it took him maybe the consumer journey, you know, he was clicking on Google, and basically imagine all the work that the merchant, that the UK merchant did to get Matt into the position where he was actually buying those pants. And then just at checkout, he's denied the transaction, and he can't get those pants, and he goes on to some other merchant. So it's a really big deal, the second issue that he's mentioning in terms of understanding the differences in cross-border transaction versus a local transaction.
Right, right. And one of the things I really kind of mentioned at the beginning is the global shopper wants a frictionless experience. And there's nothing more friction than I've gone through the entire checkout, I've entered in my payment details, I click complete payment, and it gets declined. And most times what happens is I just think that's, oh, I must, you know, done a lot of shopping this month, and my credit limit is low or something, right? Like, you don't necessarily put that the reason that it's failing is because of the way that the merchant is processing this transaction. So a lot of times if that happens, you are just absolutely losing that sale. They're not trying again. And what I use that Starbucks example because what this shows, it's a little fuzzy in this picture, but it's actually something that I did at Starbucks. And I was getting a text message from my bank, Citibank, saying, oh, you know, you went to Misguided and you bought this thing for $65, but it looks fishy to us, right? That causes a lot of friction. It doesn't give me a lot of, if I'm not aware of Misguided and I don't feel that, I just don't know them to be extremely trustworthy, and I see that come up, I'm not going through with that transaction, right? Because it's, again, they want a secure checkout. My bank flags that as risky, chances are you're going to lose that sale.
And Misguided is that UK retailer that you're purchasing from, right?
I'm sorry, Carl, what was that?
Oh, I was just saying Misguided. I just want to confirm that Misguided is that UK retailer that you are purchasing from.
Exactly, yeah. So this is an example of a U.S. customer purchasing something cross-border, but the banking world, it works the same exact way if this was a UK customer buying from a U.S. retailer. I just use this as an example because it was my card. It's easier to share that with the world. And another huge thing that happens with when you process cross-border that you need to be aware of is something that's called foreign transaction fees. And I don't know how many people on the call do travel, but a lot of times, like anytime that you go to all these airports, you'll see all of these signs for like credit card fees that don't charge foreign transaction fees. And the reason, and these are for usually high premium, high interest rate cards, because the reason is the large majority of all credit and debit cards do charge foreign transaction fees. And so what that fee is basically anytime that you're buying something from anytime from, like, say, a UK customer is buying something from a US retailer, or an Australian customer buying from a US retailer, because it's not local, domestic processing, they're going to get charged these extra fees, generally around 3%. And that's something that you see after the purchase that they get on their credit card statement. But you just look at that as being a horrible experience. And when you look at the creating and establishing the customer lifetime value and having them come back as a recurring customer, anytime that people get hit with hidden fees or surprise fees, it can really destroy that relationship. So when you look at it with local acquiring, you're going to absolutely have much higher approval rates, much lower processing fees, and a much better customer experience. So looking at when you're really going and expanding globally, it's really understanding the payment network and really looking into how am I processing this transaction. Another thing that we really mentioned on the initial slide was, again, people also want to pay in their preferred payment method. And this is of incredibly importance because, you know, in the U.S., it's predominantly dominated by, like, you know, credit cards and PayPal. Amazon Pay and Apple Pay are coming up. But ultimately, if you offer credit cards and PayPal, anyone that wants to buy from your website, you're going to basically have everyone covered. It's not like that in other markets. As you see here, I just have a couple of examples where in Germany, like basically the preferred payment method that they like to pay with online, credit cards only represent 25% of the market. Like having the ability to pay with ELV or invoice within Germany, if you don't offer it, you're really going to hurt your conversion rates. The same thing for, like, the Netherlands. You have Ideal, which is absolutely the preferred payment method. So adding Ideal to your checkout will really help increase conversions, and also that trust factor with that local consumer, because they know that, okay, they accept this local payment method, I feel more secure with that. And in some of these markets where you go into, like, more developing markets like Brazil or Mexico or within Asia, there's absolutely where credit cards just don't have the penetration rate, and you really have to focus on alternative payment methods. And to put this in reference to, like, a U.S. retailer selling into the U.S., for some of these markets, it's not offering some of these alternative payment methods is the same as if on your website you offered Visa and Amex and PayPal but didn't accept MasterCard. You are just automatically cutting off a large percentage of people that can buy from your website. Like, for example, like I go in my wallet, I have a MasterCard. I have no idea why I have a MasterCard. That's just what my bank gave me, right? So if I were to go there and try to buy, you didn't accept MasterCard, I couldn't buy from you. So the same is true if you go to, like, maybe the Netherlands and you're not offering Ideal, or if you're going to China, you don't offer Alipay. You're just not going to be able to, there's going to be a large portion of the population that are unable to buy from you. So as you really expand, it's really important to understand what are the consumer preferences, what are the main payment methods that I need to accept to really go in. Because one thing is, if you're going into any of these markets and you're spending a bunch of money on marketing, or you're really getting your shipping and logistics correct for that specific market, if you're leaving a big hole in the payment space, you're just going to be hurting yourself, basically shooting yourself in the foot. And another thing that I mentioned early on was causing a lot of friction is the fraud. So as you see, like, online fraud is growing and needs to be taken very seriously. So that is something you have to be very aware of. But that's not. But you have to be very aware of it in your domestic market, just as your international market. But oftentimes, what we see is when people will still utilize their same fraud strategy that they have in the U.S., and they'll keep that same fraud strategy as they do into the international markets. Or they look at, oh, I'm going cross-border now, so it's going to be higher risk, so I need to set tighter rule set. So what happens is you will end up rejecting way too many transactions just because you see it as a higher risk. Because one thing is I've seen working with retailers based all over the world is typically you'll see is like a U.S. retailer, when they expand, they're going to usually see more than double the rejection rate by percentage on fraud versus what they see in the domestic market. And then, but you'll see the same thing for, like, say, a German-based retailer selling to the U.S. They'll see a double rate of rejection for the U.S. transactions versus what they do see in their domestic market. And you say, well, why is that? Why does, like, a U.S. retailer see double the rate of fraud rejections in Germany, and that German retailer sees a double rate of fraud in the U.S.? And it's not because, like, the U.S. is more risky and has greater fraud, or Germany has a higher risk or greater fraud. It's really the knowledge into that market. It's setting up the proper rules to understanding the consumer trends. So because the truth is there's not more fraud in Germany and there's not more fraud in the U.S. It's just setting up the proper fraud strategy in each market. So it really comes down to knowledge. Because as you go into it, your current fraud provider or a lot of the fraud providers utilize the same tools, like device fingerprinting, IP geolocation, all of these various tools. But it's really like, how do you utilize those tools within each specific country? So, like, right here we have kind of like a fun little quiz where you look at these transactions, and you really say, looking at this, if you have a transaction that's based in Malaysia that has a credit card that's basically linked to 5 separate email addresses versus, like, say, the same transaction but based in the U.S. So it's one credit card with 5 different emails. And really understanding, well, which one of these looks like fraud? So when you look at this, obviously, so in the U.S., if you have a transaction, and this is just typically, if you have a transaction with a credit card that's linked to several different email addresses, that's a major red flag, and that you should absolutely decline it. But when you look at, like, say, in the Asia Pacific, using Malaysia as an example, the credit card penetration rate is much lower. So it's very common for one credit card to actually be shared among the entire family. So you may have a brother, you have like a mother and a father and a brother and an uncle all utilizing the same card that's all linked to different emails. But in this world, this is actually something that's very common. But in the same instance, if you say have a U.S. transaction that it has one email is linked to 4 credit cards, well, that's pretty standard, right? A lot of people have 3 to 4 credit cards in their wallet. So that doesn't look fraudulent at all. But if you have some of these developing markets, if you see one credit card, one email linked to 4 credit cards, well, that's fraud. I mean, that's not at all within the norm, and that's something that is most likely the guy has a bunch of stolen cards. So it's really just understanding to make sure that you're tweaking these rule sets to be specific to each market. Make sure that you, for one, protect yourself against fraud, but have the highest conversion rate and allow the least friction to your buyer.
And I would point out that, I mean, whether it's fraud that you're talking about or negotiating the pricing in the contract with your payment provider, or certainly, optimizing your payment solution, all of this comes down to working with individuals and teams that have expertise around global payments and fraud, because you could have the best fraud tool set available to mankind. But unless you have a team that really understands how to provide the context and really the ability to set the rule set up for international fraud, it's not going to do you any good. So what we've found over and over again is that there's a lot of domestic expertise in these different areas, but again, it comes down to, okay, what's the global nuance and how do you deal with it? It goes as well with procurement departments. So I mentioned, how do you choose and identify the right types of fraud teams, the right types of companies to work with? Procurement departments and people that are involved with their normal domestic payments might not sort of understand the complexities and how to sort of identify the right type of vendor for a service abroad. So, throughout your company, I would suggest, making sure that you're working with companies and individuals and experts that have that type of knowledge and expertise so that you can make, the necessary tweaks and get the necessary information and hopefully grow your core competency, your payments and money management and fraud management competency, global competencies within your own company.
Yeah. So as just going into deeper in this, going into the frictionless experience, so just summing up a lot of this stuff, like overly restrictive fraud rules it causes a lot of friction, whether if you're just rejecting the transaction or a lot of times we'll see retailers that require additional steps for that international customer. Maybe they have to scan something in and email them proof or sign additional forms. And if I'm looking to buy a product and they have to do anything, I'm used to a seamless experience. And if you have additional steps for me to do, you're going to lose my sale. And most of the buyers out there you're going to lose their sale if you make it too restrictive. Another big thing, is just summing up, is how you're processing these transactions versus local versus cross-border. Having your transaction decline because of how it's being processed, or getting an email from your bank saying that this transaction looks fishy, do you want to go through with it? That causes a lot of friction. One other piece that this doesn't really matter who your payment provider is, it's just really clearly stating the privacy and data security policies on the checkout. So when you're going there and before someone enters in their payment details, it's very clear that a lot of times there's a lot of very good logos you can utilize, but it's really important that you actually say, this is how this information is going to be encrypted. This is our PCI level, or this is our payment provider's PCI level. Because within international markets, it is much more important than a lot of times what we see in the U.S. market. Because having stuff like that is important in the U.S. market, but even more so in the international market. So making sure that through the checkout, you make sure that you call out before they actually put in their payment details exactly how you're trusted and how the information is going to be handled. Basically everything is encrypted through an SL socket or whatever that is. And of course, another thing really that causes a lot of friction is shoppers getting hit with any type of extra or hidden fees charged after the transactions. I mentioned foreign transaction fees, but oftentimes too, it's either the PayPal or the issuing banks. If you're not pricing that local currency and they're buying a product, let's say $100, $200 US, and they think that they're going to pay one price because they went into xt.com or something before they actually made it and saw what the exchange rate is, and then they see what the price that they actually paid in that local currency after their bank applied the markup, usually have an upset customer as well. So that, again, you'll have a higher rate of refunds and you're going to have less repeat buyers. And again, obviously, another big friction is, again, not offering the customer's preferred payment method. So again, because a lot of customers, this is U.S.-based retailers, is you realize eliminating this type of friction in your U.S. checkout is incredibly important. and it's even more so in the international markets. So focusing on these key pieces to make sure that you optimize these pieces to eliminate the friction, you're going to have a much higher sales rate into the global market. And that's basically here. I mean, I'm more than happy to open it up to any questions.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you going through the slide presentation on payments. I thought it was very interesting. Operator, can you open up the lines or make the announcement for anybody who may have an audio question that they'd like to ask? And in the meantime, Carl, are you still with us, and do you have any additional comments?
Yeah, thank you. So the thing that I would bring out as well is for those of you that have, B2B business, there are elements of global payments and money management, obviously, that have been talked about today that do apply to your business. So currency management, obviously, is a big one. Others include, obviously understanding how credit card networks work, as many of your other businesses may pay via credit card. Areas that are less important are alternative payments, as most B2B payments, unless they're smaller payments, would not necessarily happen over an alternative payment network, as those are more consumer, tied to individual consumers. But then there's also additional information that you should probably learn about around, global business escrow accounts and some of the other topics that we weren't able to cover today, but that we can certainly follow up with some additional information around. Other than that, I don't know if there's any additional questions, but I did want to point out for those on the B2B side how you can contextualize the content that was provided today.
Yeah, and just quickly on that, Carl, is one of the big things like with B2B is quite often they'll invoice that international customer, that international business in US dollars, and it's like a bank account information. So then that international customer then has to do a bank wire. So they have to go to their bank and get usually a very unfavorable exchange rate. They then have to then wire those funds out, which is very costly and usually time-consuming. And anytime that you have, like, again, that cross-border transaction, there's more banks involved in the process, these what they call corresponding banks. So what happens a lot of times is they may have an invoice for $10,000, but because all these banks kind of take a piece of the pie as it passes through their bank, a lot of times you're going to get less than that. And you have everyone upset, like, well, I for one, I had to do this many euros, but the bank said it would be 10,000 euros that you're 10,000 US dollars, but they're only getting 9,840. And it's very hard to map and everything. So there's a lot of ways, again, by localizing it, that you can streamline the process. So again, even with the B2B, it's really eliminating a lot of this friction and allowing a seamless, transparent process for B2B as well.
Great. Operator, can you make that announcement?
Yes, at this time, if you'd like to ask a question over the phone line, please ensure your phone is unmuted on your end and press *1 to place your line into the queue. Once again, that's *1 if you'd like to ask your question verbally. One moment for those to come through.
Thank you. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I just wanted to remind everybody that this is the third installment of an ongoing series under the Getting to Global E-commerce 101 series. The next webinar that we will be hosting is scheduled for September 13th on e-commerce logistics, followed by October 18th covering legal and regulatory issues in the e-commerce space. And then in November 15th, we have the first webinar on e-commerce technology, and then followed up with the second part of that technology discussion on December 13th with e-commerce technology 102. Operator, any questions?
We have no questions at this time.
Okay. Then I just wanted to, again, thank all of the participants for joining the call today to learn more about our e-commerce payments 101, and thank you, Matt and Carl, both, for sharing your insights. It's always very, very helpful to hear directly from industry.